Now normally the things I'm looking on the ground are adaptation projects. What will help fish and wildlife survive? But before you can have adaptation, you need to relieve the cause in the first place. You need to relieve carbon pollution and greenhouse gases.
Thank you very much. We'll appreciate that. My friend Peter Schober today serves as the president of the Montana Association of Churches. He's also the pastor at University Congregational Church. Peter and I had a discussion earlier about our mutual appreciation for words. Peter has about 45 minutes worth of remarks for you this morning, so please settle in. Pastor Schober.
Thank you, John. Am I supposed to get a green light? Is it on?
You are, sir.
Okay. You might notice in the notes that everyone else has 3 or 4 minutes, and next to me it says 2 minutes.
I don't have that timeline, sir.
I am the token non-empiricist up here today. I'm a preacher, and one of the things I'd like to simply say is that the earth sciences and spirituality related to our earth are not as far apart as people might like to think. It's an amazing time to be a religious professional, because you understand that forms of spirituality are changing in many and wonderful ways. And one of them is that we understand that there isn't a separation between earth and spirit. That all of these things are integrated. And so that's wonderful. I'm humbled and thankful for being on this vast group of folks. I also want to thank the EPA for coming up with these standards. It's wonderful to be guided by standards, and without them, I think we find ourselves lost oftentimes. It's also wonderful to have this gathering today. Today we begin Holy Week, which is a real precious, sacred week for people of the Christian tradition. On Saturday, our Jewish brothers and sisters begin Passover. I think both really speak to the blessedness of life and of earth. It's a time when we lift up the Creator and give thanks for creation and come to deeper understandings, hopefully, that they're connected to each other. And that's powerful. One of the thoughts I wanted to lift up is that we, as I kind of mentioned before, we should never separate the environmental from the spiritual. And we tend to do it a lot, but the good news is that we're doing it less. We're learning a new language, a different way of being. We connect the material with the spiritual. And faith traditions from all kinds of backgrounds are lifting that up as being a very, very important thing. And I think that's powerful. I'd like to close with a quote from an Episcopal theologian who's done a lot of work in environmental theology. Her name is the Reverend Canon Sally Bingham. We cannot take up and sustain this enormous task of global mobilization without a deep understanding of how our faith calls us to this challenge. It's not enough to change light bulbs. We must change our very hearts. We are called to look again at our sacred texts and scriptures and see the truths that have been there all along. That earth is our home, our responsibility, and a sacred place. And it's wonderful to be able to get together and celebrate something good. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Schober. Folks, Dick Barrett served admirably as an economics professor at the University of Montana for many years and continues his service to the community in the state of Montana as a representative currently for Montana House District 47. Professor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know how Steve feels about this, but usually economists don't come last. But I think it's appropriate. We should come after health, and we should come after fish and wildlife, and we should come after planetary science, and we should come after spirituality. I don't know, but I suspect that many of the people at this table, and certainly my constituents, and I as an individual and as a legislator, have been disappointed, not to say alarmed, by the progress that we have made as a nation in controlling climate change, or controlling our contribution to climate change. 4 years ago, I think we had some hope, but it seems to have disappeared from national consciousness. Except now we do have this initiative coming from the EPA. And I think it's an important, as Steve said, first step, sort of a symbolic first step. But I do want to emphasize another point that Beth made, which is that she hopes it has more teeth. And I want to talk a little bit about the more teeth that I think we're going to need to have in the future. We haven't talked very much about the specifics of these regulations, but in essence what they do is they limit the emissions from any future power plants built in the United States, any future power plants. And the nature of the regulation is such that the only kind of power plants that can meet that standard are gas-fired ones. So coal-fired power plants at this point cannot meet the standard and will not be able to meet the standard until and unless they develop carbon sequestration capture that's sufficiently cheap and sufficiently effective to actually make it practicable. So what the policy does is, in essence, say that any future thermally fired power plants in the United States will be gas-fired for the foreseeable future. And the thing that you have to understand is that was going to happen anyway. That is to say, even the EPA says that there are no power plants, coal-fired power plants planned in the United States. The reason is that the economics of gas-fired power plants, natural gas combined cycle power plants, is that they are currently cheaper to build than coal plants. So that's where the power companies were going to go anyway. However, that can change. We've seen volatility in the prices of things like natural gas and coal, and it could be that the economics will change in the future. It could be that a globalization of the natural gas market, to a greater extent than it is globalized now, would result in an increase in the price of natural gas, and it would no longer be so competitive. At that point, the regulations would begin to have some teeth in terms of the new power plants. But I think it's important to understand, again, that even with this policy in place, and even if this policy does have the effect of enforcing the use of natural gas in the future, not just a market phenomenon, but of enforcing the use of natural gas in future power plants, emissions will still grow. Emissions will still grow. And what that means is, because we're using natural gas instead of coal, they'll be growing more slowly than they otherwise would, but they'll still be growing. And I think Steve will tell you that what we ultimately need to be doing is reducing, not growing more slowly, but reducing our emissions. And that's going to be critical in the future. And the only way that we can do that is by getting control of the existing coal-fired power plants that produce 40% of U.S. carbon emissions. So that's going to have to happen in the future. That's the next step. That's where the teeth come in. And I think that that's going to be very important, the very important next step for the EPA. How are we going to get control of them? Well, it's possible that the sequestration technology will come along. It's possible that those coal plants will simply be phased out and replaced by natural gas, or replaced by other renewables, wind, solar, whatever. But it has to happen. It has to happen until the teeth are big enough to bite into that established coal-fired generating capacity. We're not going to be able to reduce emissions. We're only going to keep them from growing as fast. The only note of caution that I would make about this is that last week when Administrator Jackson at the EPA announced these new regulations, she also said that the EPA at this point has no plans to regulate existing power plants. So the EPA is not yet prepared to move forward, but I think it's going to be our job at this point to see that happens.
Thank you, Representative Barrett. And last but not least, a gentleman I regard as a Renaissance realtor, Steve Korick, ladies and gentlemen, pays attention to lots of things in our community and does so thoughtfully. And also, you know, when you're a realtor, you like to have 2 or 3 things sort of to back you up, right? So one of Steve's other enterprises is he's a partner at Algae Aquaculture Technology. Steve.
Thank you, John. Renaissance realtor, I like that. Like a really, really old house. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the opportunity that's implied in these regulations, because regulations not only limit, but they also point a future. And in this case, they point to a future for Montana that emphasizes the greatest resource we have. A tongue-in-cheek way of looking at this that I'd like to share with people is asking everyone if they can think of what the biggest solar collector in the state of Montana is. And the answer is, it's the state of Montana. All the trees, all the grass, the wind that blows across the plains, the water that runs the hydro dams, this whole cycle is driven by solar energy, and it is the resource that our great-grandparents used, that our grandparents used, that my dad used when he ran Champion Timberlands here in Montana, and it is the resource that will be with us forever. Coal at best, or at worst, would be with us for a couple hundred years, but this resource that provides the basis for the solar energy industry, for the wind energy industry, in which we're either number 1 or 2 in terms of available resource in the country, for the timber industry and the biomass industry, for the agricultural industry, is going to be with us forever. It is necessarily the industry that will be fueling the economic standard 7 generations from now. It must. And the thing is that coal is a limited resource. It will only be here for a couple hundred years. However, the carbon dioxide that it produces, some of it will still be with us in the atmosphere in 1,000 years. And so we need to realize that there are very, very long-term implications of what we're doing right now. I'm here on my own, but I also am an investor in algae aquaculture technology. I'm a green realtor and also on the board of directors of New World Wind Power in Billings. And what all of those share is that the opportunity that comes from this legislation gives us a market signal that we can begin to trust. We need new money put into alternative energy, to the kinds of technology that we're developing. And when there are regulations like this that actually effectively monetize the costs that are there that would be there with a new coal plant, it allows us to have a clear market signal. It clarifies the risks that are available for different kinds of investments within society, and it makes it very clear to would-be renewable energy investors that there is going to be a very clear future that is going to produce a very predictable net return on investment. And so we're excited that these regulations have been put in place, and I think that they will help us in Montana remember what we've always known, is that we live a life of the land and on the land and for the land. And that's why we're the great conservatives who know that we must pass this land down in a healthy form to the generations after generations after generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, the panel will take your questions. Ms. Baller.